So, my name is Mark, and I am doing a PhD in religious studies and geography. And the thrust of it is to try and figure out what makes people think and feel certain things about the environment. I'm looking in particular on salmon farming. My previous project was on national parks. And before we begin, I wanted to make sure we had a common ground around religious studies, which is why I've asked you to write down the things which you think all religions have in common. And we could either read them out, or you could hand them in to me and I'll read them out anonymously, because sometimes people get a bit shy reading out what they've written. Yeah.
I think we should just be honestly who we are, but anyway.
Okay.
I have no idea.
I guess that the hard thing is that I'm probably gonna be in a disproving mindset and telling you why you're wrong, because religious studies is like an interesting thing, because it's one of the only fields of study that doesn't believe in the thing that it's studying.
Okay.
Or rather, it conceives of religion as being a very wide and multifarious and wibbly collection of things. For instance, not all religions think about internal belief as being a definer of religion.
Okay. That's wrong then.
Many languages don't even have a word for religion, but we look at them and we think, hey, these people are religious. They're doing spiritual stuff. Belief in a god, that excludes Buddhism, one of the world's largest religions.
Yeah, I haven't put that, but yeah.
In fact, my PhD supervisor has an essay which talks about how Christianity doesn't fit its own requirements. So if we think it's internal belief, and a lot of Christian scholars think it's internal belief, what are we doing on Sunday? Kneeling and standing up and eating special bits of bread. That's not internal, that's external.
Yeah.
And so on and so on. Does anybody think they have a really good answer that I haven't debunked?
Faith. Yeah.
Faith, yeah. I think that faith is a good answer. I think it's a Christian-centric answer, because there'll be lots of people who are doing activities that seem to be spiritually important or morally significant in a way that is, cosmic and cosmological, that doesn't include faith or believing in something. In fact, there are loads of Christian activities that don't seem to be oriented in faith. Again, I don't know, you could say externally that loads of things that aren't internal aren't faith-based. Does that make sense?
Perhaps I'd like to hear more about that another time.
Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Worship.
Sure. So if worship is central to religions, there seems to be lots of worshipful activities that aren't worship-oriented. So it's quite hard to define worship. And be like, this is worship, and then we're done with the worship, and now we're having a meal. But you can have a meal in a worshipful way. Anyway, I know I'm being
lots of worship actually. I mean, lots of Christians are very ambivalent about what worship is. You go to the Church of England, and they're very
Maybe I should say acts of worship.
Conflicting.
I'm trying to keep it really broad because you said all religions.
Yeah. I guess that I'm deliberately being a stick in the mud here and trying to be difficult. But my project, a core bit of my project is looking at religion very broadly and the things that people bring into those interactions very broadly, because the number of factors that we bring into ecology is very broad. So we're going to be looking at some of the inner religious thinking of conservation structures like national parks and farms, which we happen to be very close to and functioning within a nested series of. But later in this talk, you might be like, well, Mark, that's not really a religious thing. But it's part of this overlapping circle of thought and feeling and importance that out of which we construct religion in the religious studies. So hopefully that's amused your bouche for what's to come.
I was going to say, I now have no idea what religion is.
Andrew, what other people wrote?
Well, I took it in a different way. So I said, mankind trying to reach God. So, as opposed to relational, which is God trying to reach man. And also rule-based and legalistic. So religion is by its nature rule-based and legalistic, whereas I think faith or relational faith is not.
Oh, okay. You're making that distinction.
So I'm
So interpreted religion
and you
differently.
could actually say within the environmental concerns you have the legalistic shod people. Correctly. and those who just actually are just normal.
Yeah.
They're not trying to.
normal.
They're not trying. Well, it's like they get their worth from being unshod. You know, that's their worth. They're gaining life from it because it's their definition of who they are.
What the religion is.
The religion is. Whereas if you're in a relationship, you don't necessarily get your life from a thing, you get it from a person.
I think that's such a good distinction, and I think we should come back to that at the end, because using those, again, like religion and environmentalism overlap in a lot of ways, and using that kind of framework to look at environmentalism could be really fruitful, because some people think it is, top down and legalistic.
Yeah, the zealots.
You do have the zealots, and when it comes to our place in it, do we want to be telling people what to do, or do we want city-dwelling parliamentarians telling us what to do, or do we, as people who inhabit the landscape, have like something else to say? And,
it's like you've got the ultimate religion is we have a law, and that law says he must die, and there's an element in environmentalism that is getting to that stage where you would rather kill the people who are polluting. You know?
yeah. It's really interesting. I went on a Wikipedia rabbit hole about King Charles's environmentalism, which leans heavily into ecofascism and always has done. Oh, how good! So we're excelling. So my version of the key questions that we might want to look at, but obviously we're beyond that, and we're generating our own excellent questions. But just in case we were a really stiff audience, I'd pose these questions. How do we relate to nature, wider creation, and the wild in ourselves? What is the Christian connection to conservation structures that we see around us? And what does rewilding and stewardship mean in the 21st century? So ideally, we'll come back at the end of the presentation with like different ideas or tools to bring into the discussion around those questions. Or maybe we'll be talking about fascism. I guess we'll see. So picture this: 150 years ago, we were well under the way of creating the Anthropocene, and the empire was pushing into new frontiers and having huge, sudden environmental impacts. This is a picture of a pile of buffalo skulls, bison skulls in the States, piled high. They are. They were just so easy to kill. They used to have special train guns mounted on the back of trains. They just ride across the plains and just shoot and then go back and get them all. And they're now coming out of the other side of being like endangered in the US. There were so many bones that they came up with new systems of refining sugar using bones. It was completely a byproduct. So this was the kind of landscape that early environmentarians, conservationists were looking at, especially in the States, which they viewed as being this relatively pure and untouched, beautiful landscape that was being destroyed by European influence. And coming out of like smog-filled London, going to find a place to build your farm, there was this agrarian sense of identity and a pronounced sense that humans were ruining what they found. This is a quote from William Temple Hornaday, who was a conservationist of the bisons, and he did a big taxidermied exhibit for the bisons at the Smithsonian. He says, 30 years ago, I was a sincere optimist on the impulses and good faith of humanity and the moral fiber and intelligence of civilized man. Today, I think that speaking generally, civilized man is an unmitigated ass. And this was written in a note that he hid in the taxidermied buffalo for the future.
Really?
Because he fully expected them to be extinct by the time we found that note, and luckily they're not. I'm wondering who can tell me who this handsome fellow might be. Don't look at the answers on the corner of the screen.
Not Muir, is it?
Muir.
It is Muir. Very good. Maybe you recognize him from his contemplative aura and his big, long, bushy beard. So John Muir was a very influential early environmentalist who was also very significantly a Christian. And interestingly enough, he wrote a series of diaries, and his famous writings are pitched as his imminent writings when he's out in the fields, like January 1st, today I kayaked down the river, January 2nd, I had a nice fire and saw some great trees. And his beautiful, evocative nature language that were very, very widely read and very influential. they also are not imminent or biographical. He kept his notes, and then later in life he edited them and he published them as though they were. And contained within there is a very well-rounded philosophy, and he knew exactly what he wanted to say. And you can see how these stories have been changed and revised through different drafts. He'll change them from being fictional to being about him, and he will layer in religious language, and he'll layer out other things to make it fit its point. So they're really quite thematically complete bits of nature writing, which are very important. His books have been read by millions. He was extremely important in establishing the first national parks. He founded the Sierra Club, which is still operating today. He took out, or was invited by the president. There he is. Who knows who that president is?
Lincoln.
No.
Yeah, it's a bit late, isn't it?
It's
I don't know my memory.
Roosevelt.
it's Roosevelt, yeah. Who I think is very distinctively a cowboy.
I'm looking at the wrong one now.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, he does look kind of like Lincoln, doesn't he? Yeah, Muir's on the right. President Roosevelt is on the left. So Roosevelt was a big fan of Muir, and he asked him to accompany him on horseback out into the forest. They went out for 3 days on their own, just the two of them.
Muir asked the president.
The president asked Muir, and Muir wasn't that interested, allegedly, according to himself. He said, "I have no more interest in meeting the president as the next man." However, he saw the chance to leverage some conservation capital, and so he took him out for 3 nights into the forest. Muir's a big fan of the redwoods, and the redwoods were all in that part of California. He says, "I might be able to do some forest good in freely talking around the campfire." So he took him out into the trees. And when Roosevelt came back, he was so moved by what he'd heard that he immediately instructed his secretary to commission his work, start the process. And he gave a great big talk after he came back, which echoes Muir's language. He said, "Lying out at night under those giant sequoias was lying in a temple built by no hand of man. A temple grander than a human architect could by any possibility build. And I hope for the preservation of the groves of giant trees simply because it would be a shame to our civilization to let them disappear. They are monuments in themselves." Something that isn't too obvious to us, but would have been obvious to contemporary readers of this speech, is he's echoing Muir's language there. He printed a thing called God's First Temples, which was about the national forests. And this notion that Yosemite was a temple crafted by the hands of God is something he frequently comes back to. He called the Hetch Hetchy Valley a temple far holier than any consecrated by humans. He stated in another publication that no temples made with hands can compare with Yosemite. In one of his publications, he referred to the granite walls of Yosemite as monuments noble and enduring. Another publication, he calls the trees a monumental fir, and the largest amongst them the majestic monument of the Kings River forest. Roosevelt's impact was profound. Although the National Park Service was founded after he left office, in his time he established 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 53 wildlife sanctuaries, which was then brought under that umbrella later on. When they were formed, they quoted this speech in the Constitution saying that they were to leave these spaces unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Roosevelt eventually wrote an obituary for John Muir when he died in 1914, and he commended Muir's ability to influence contemporary thought and action on the subjects to which he had devoted his life. An interesting thing that Muir and Roosevelt both had in common, they clearly share a lot of thoughts and opinions, and they clearly are both engaging with this Edenic landscape and about the clear created nature of what they found there, is that they were both raised Presbyterian, and Campbellite Presbyterian, in fact. And the Presbyterians were only about 7% of the American population at the time. However, almost every significant conservationist, Ansel Adams, Henry David Thoreau, Muir, Roosevelt, Pinchot, I won't name them anymore because you'll recognize them and I won't remember them all, but pretty much everyone of note not only came from that 7% of American society, which was this particular church, but were no further than 1 generation removed from a single church in a single New England town.
Wow.
This was identified by Mark Stahl in this book. And his idea is that there's something about being a Christian broadly, being a Presbyterian more specifically, and maybe the teachings of this little group that made people excellent environmentalists.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and it's kind of like being a latent Catholic. You know, you're raised a Catholic and you have guilt forever.
Yeah.
He's saying that, like, you know, whether or not these people went on to be hopping up and down and talking about God and being Presbyterians, they had latent Presbyterianism. That's what he's saying from his book. There was something about being raised Presbyterian, something that stayed behind after creed and dogma fell away, that made excellent environmental leaders. These themes of beauty of creation, nature's effortless praise of the Creator, blissful Eden, post-lapsarian misery and sin, and hopes for salvation. Post-lapsarian, that means like after the fall. So after Eden, the misery and sin that comes from sin, comes from the fall. And hopes for salvation occupied Reformed minds for centuries. So, you know, Presbyterianism you might recognize as being the fire and brimstone kind of Scottish Christianity. Muir's own father was a very angry individual who didn't let his wife play the fiddle. It was too much joy after she was married. Muir said that his father regarded them as amongst the foulest creatures of the earth. And this
So regarded who?
just all of them, just the whole of humanity, and I didn't put any of it in because it's sad, but his dad had a very dim view of humanity, and something about that translates into this kind of conservationism.
And that's what you hear in his note and thing.
Yeah, that we are broken and ruining things, and out there in like the Western Americas and the places that we haven't been is like this beautiful untouched nature that we have to protect from us. And that's what they're doing. They're trying to preserve nature from human impact.
So Calvin does have something good to say.
Oh, before we make statements like it's good,
Well, good to say.
Positive.
Can something positive come out of Calvin?
That's cathedral. No.
I think this is the.
Arches of Corridor.
Oh, you know,
Royal Arches, something like that.
you'll definitely recognize
Flying, basically.
some of the things to come. Yeah. So that's Muir admiring the arches, which hadn't been climbed yet. It wouldn't be for many years. Here, there's just more. I just provided more evidence around how Muir views this as being Eden. So he called Yosemite the very best of Eden's fruits. He referred to glaciation, which made the valley, as the working of divine harmonious law. And throughout, it's peppered with evangelical literature that we wouldn't recognize. There's lots of Milton in there, lots of references to Paradise Lost, which an audience can miss, but it would have been ubiquitous at the time. He talks about how he's trying to spell out the mountain truths in the landscape, which were predestined, unknown to light, unborn. And there being some divine created order in creation, I think is a pretty familiar Christian idea. He said that he was baptized in the waters of the Yosemite waterfall, and he had the sacrament of the sap upon his skin. And not only is the landscape an impression of God, it takes on a co-creative role. So he's clearly trying to protect the pure landscape from unmitigated asses, which seems pretty worthwhile. And bearing in mind that he's one amongst many people, environmentalists, trying to do this with a Christian bent, we can look at some more work here. This is from Ansel Adams, who is a very famous nature photographer, and you see his stuff all the time. This is looking down the valley. Excellent rock climbing there on the left. Have you been? Have you climbed there?
I've done the one on the right, Half Dome.
Is that Half Dome?
And
Oh, is that it poking out?
down on the right.
Is that it there?
I think, yes.
Very good. Very good.
I guess that was El Cap on the left.
It looks like it, doesn't it? The nose of it. The sheerness is El Cap, I think. So Ansel Adams took this photo, which is 1937, a view down the valley. And this is what people in the East Coast and people back in England were seeing. This is incredible, untouched landscape, and it's quite unlike anything we'd see here, right? These huge sheer walls of granite. And this is one of several valleys side by side. One was flooded to make a reservoir, which Muir was pretty salty about. A friend of Ansel's said, there was always been a touch of the New England preacher about Ansel. His image of Yosemite had deep spiritual meaning. He called it a national shrine. As a child, Adams rejected religious institutions and creeds for a personal amorphous sense of deity. He believed that in natural landscapes without human presence, the clear realities of nature, seen with the inner eye of the spirit, reveal the ultimate echo of God. Moreover, he wrote that humanity's future depends on such places. Quote, in contemplation of the internal incarnations of the spirit which vibrate in every mountain, leaf, and particle of earth, and every cloud, stone, and flash of sunlight, we make new discoveries on the planes of ethical and humane discernment, approaching the new society, at last, proportionate to nature. And this is what they're aiming for. Society is in its bubble, proportionate to nature out in nature's bubble, and never the twain. They don't intermingle. We preserve this crystalline Edenic nature, and we stay in our dirty towns. But I have a question for Ansel Adams. Where are the Indians? In all of this, aren't they ignoring the fact that people were already living there? In fact, you could make a pretty good argument that they never encountered Eden at all. Here we see a photo of, I don't know how to say it correctly, but I'm going to say Awanichi Indians. There's also southern Miwok who live in the area. It's hard to know how many people were living there before the Europeans interfered. One survey said that there were 19,000 members, but this was post-pandemic of Europeans brought loads of diseases, so it's hard to know. And there was persecution, of course, and they were broadly disregarded. If true, if there were 19,000 people there, that modest estimation would mean that pre-contact California was the most densely populated region in North America. So there were people there, quite a few people as these things go. And they'd been there for around about 10,000 years before the first white sighting for Europeans met them. So obviously there's some racism at play. Muir himself has a pretty contemptuous view of the natives. He calls them a strangely dirty and irregular life. These dark-eyed, dark-haired, half-happy savages lead in this clean wilderness. So they are dirty and the wilderness is clean. He travels with Indians at various points, but he never gives them a voice in his writings. He says that he trades with them, but he describes them as begging in return. So I think that there are several things there. Victorian racism is one of them. Also, them as intruders into his vision of an Eden which is clean is another thing that we can take out of that statement. Critically, these people living there engaged with the ecosystem. There is mixed conifer forest throughout Eastern California, and it's from those trees that they made a wonderful living. The black oak acorn was grounded up, soaked, boiled, and baked into loaves, which provided about 60% of the diet was eating acorns. Well, I'm sure we do weird stuff as well to eat. Supple shrubs were used for basketry. Herbaceous plants provided fiber, which were made into string. The land management strategies of the native people consisted of a consistent and deliberate regime of disturbance in order to maximize useful output of plant species. Those techniques included irrigation, pruning, selective harvesting, where you take the buds off and promote new branches to grow for basket making, and very importantly, controlled burning, which cleared out the understory and allowed a greater yield of useful crops. This influence was so deeply integrated in the region that the forced expulsion of indigenous people by the European settlers caused rapid ecological change. In fact, continues to cause rapid ecological change. Maybe you've noticed that there's a lot of wildfires in California. One is pictured here. So maybe what Muir missed, and the downside of this kind of Calvinism, is that the people who were living there were doing a very important ecological function. Muir was particularly concerned with the preservation of the redwoods, and he was worried that that controlled burnings would get out of hand and burn down the redwoods. And I'm sure that there's evidence of redwoods being taken by fires that got out of hand. However, clearing out the understory prevents greater wildfires later on.
Don't know if you know, but the redwood's bark is amazingly resistant to fire. If you look at a redwood tree, the bark is like that depth, so it can get charred on the outside, but it won't reach.
Interesting.
Because it's designed actually to be in a burnt environment.
Interesting. There's also certain seeds that only activate when burned.
No. Yeah, there's a special term, I can't remember now.
Yeah. Citation needed, but I remember them being part of this ecosystem as well. So there's a study here that suggests that stopping the controlled burnings has increased the danger to the endangered redwoods.
Although the park wardens in Yosemite do control areas.
Yes, and now there's a move to give that function back to the indigenous people.
Okay.
Because why kick the people who are doing it very well off and then do it for them
Yeah.
when you could just give it back?
What a cheek taking off them in the first place.
Yeah, what a cheek, and also how counterproductive. I'm sure it's very productive if you are trying to create a place with no people, but a little counterproductive if you are trying to preserve an ecosystem. Because what the Puritans are missing, you could say, is that humans are a part of the ecosystem, like an important part of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
What happened before the first peoples arrived?
What do you mean? What happened?
Yeah, because didn't the Californian tribes, weren't they from somewhere else? Or do they think they came from there very originally?
I guess that humans are a relatively recent development everywhere. There would have been another biological stasis that is then replaced with this biological stasis.
Okay. So there would have been a different form of surviving.
Yeah, and I guess that's a question like that maybe out with our current thinking, but like where do we draw the line of what we're going to preserve? Because if we wanted to do like a Lake District, we could preserve sheep farming, or we could go back 1,000 years and preserve forests, or go back like 20,000 years and it was all snow.
Bring back the answer.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
We might have a bit of
I was just curious about the fire thing.
I guess that it would have built up and then burnt, and then there would have been destruction. Yeah, I guess that Muir viewed fire as an unalloyed bad, and I think that contemporary thinking would challenge that. There's also just more and more thinking about how to empower Indigenous people to prevent environmental destruction, because Indigenous people live rurally, and if you give rights to people to self-determine their environment, it becomes much harder to exploit the environment, because the people who live there can be like, no, thank you. The global poor are disproportionately affected by climate change and pollution, and so on and so on. And giving them the right to direct their own conservation, their own ecosystem, could be a good solution. These are all buildings in Yosemite, and you can't see half of them there. I recognize it from that angle, the famous angle. Just something here about the architecture is designed to be unobtrusive.
yeah.
And there's like this low, squat visitor center, which you can't see from the back. I think that building kind of looks like Half Dome. And you wouldn't be allowed to build a McDonald's there. So when you're driving around, it's all campsites and buildings like this. It is excellent. New McDonald's in town here, though, interestingly, a new McDonald's in town here, though, in another side of beauty and interest. So, is it working? Are national parks like managing their thing? Maybe back in Muir's day, it seemed like a very good idea because our reach seemed very small. But in a day like today, where we're increasingly aware of the impact of the global commons and the and air and pollution and everything, we now know that redwoods suffer from air pollution from Los Angeles, which is, it seems a very long way away in Muir world, but in our world, it doesn't seem so far away. This is Egremont Park in New Zealand, which I think is remarkable because you can see where the agricultural land gives way to the parkland in a very neat circle. This is Hot Springs Park in Arizona. It's quite a small park. You can see there's a scale there. It's only like about 10 miles long. But you can also see how the town, in order to engage touristically, which is its main economy, reaches right up to the edge and reaches inside of the park. And I guess my question is, there is here a clear division between nature and culture. Is that going to effectively protect the park from human influence?
Not if you've got lots of cars.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It seems like an old-fashioned idea, doesn't it? That we can just keep Australia safe.
Yeah.
Like it'll change as everything else changes. This is California's population density. This is how they think it'll change over the next 50 years. So the dark purple areas will be the places that get the most development. And this is where the parks are. So you can see that humanity is stretching out towards the parks in these areas. And again, in a way that probably seemed hard for Muir to imagine, because all of this depends on combustion engines really to get around.
And the numbers of humanity's increasing, isn't it, in number? So we're going to have more of an impact.
But it's also going to level off.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not going to go exponentially.
But it's increased in numbers since his day.
Oh, quite a lot. It's doubled since you were born, for sure. Yeah. This is me next to a redwood. And my notes here just talk about the stuff I just said about air pollution. So it might be interesting here to think about what happens to Indigenous people when other national parks have been formed. Because this was, over 100 years ago. So there are more national parks now since the first national park. What has happened? Well, the Serengeti National Park was founded in 1951, and they did indeed kick off the indigenous Maasai people. The park keeps expanding, and they keep kicking new people out. So it was under British control when they started, but it's now under local government control. And worth noting that the main industry is white tourists, right? In that national park, the people were forcibly removed, and I guess no lessons were learned by that point. I wonder what other national parks were formed in 1951. The Lake District was founded in 1951, the same year, but we did not kick off the indigenous people who lived there. I think that racism might play a part in that. But it's an interesting thing to think about, because there's a different kind of conservation happening here. It's not humans being separate from the landscape. We all live in or within a stone's throw of the landscape. So I guess there are some questions there around what kind of conserving we're doing. Sheep farming is a biotic process that we engage in and support. Are we Indigenous people performing essential ecosystem services? And what does it mean for us to be conservers and preservers and wild members of the landscape here? So hopefully that's enough to get you thinking and whet your appetite, and hopefully that's complexified your thinking just a little bit. And I'll leave those questions up in case you want to focus on them for our discussion.